The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, and it did not come by the usual post rider, but by the Duke's own steward, riding a horse lathered from a hard morning's ride, as though the matter it concerned could not wait even the small delay of ordinary delivery. He handed it down at the gate of a modest farmhouse on the edge of Ravensmoor land, without dismounting, without a word of greeting, and rode away again before the young woman who received it had so much as broken the seal. The seal bore the crest of the House of Thorn, a raven perched upon a broken crown, and the words within, in the cold, deliberate hand of Lord Cassius Thorn, Duke of Ravensmoor, concerned the settling of a debt, the division of a modest inheritance, and a choice the Duke plainly expected her to regret before the ink of his letter had even dried. She did not yet understand, reading it in the grey light of that autumn morning, that the choice she was about to make, a choice the Duke would mock so openly before the whole county, would, within a single season, humble a man who had never once in his life been made to answer for his own certainties. Before this story carries you further into barren fields and old farmhouse secrets, allow one small request. If stories of quiet women outlasting the powerful men who dismiss them are the kind that keep your evenings good company, then let that subscribe button be the thing you press right now, before this tale slips past you among so many others. And do tell us, in the comments below, where in the world you are watching from tonight. It is no small thing to imagine so many different corners of the earth listening, together, to the story of one small English farm and the harvest that came from it. Now, let us return to that autumn morning and to the letter that would change everything. Her name was Miss Helena Whitfield, and the debt described in the Duke's letter belonged, in truth, not to her, but to her late father, a gentleman farmer of modest holdings who had died some 4 months before, leaving behind obligations to the House of Thorn that exceeded, by a considerable margin, whatever the remainder of his small estate could satisfy. The Duke held the mortgage upon nearly everything her father had once possessed, as he held the mortgages of half the smaller farms scattered across the parish, and the letter that arrived that Tuesday morning offered Helena, in place of the debt's full and ruinous collection, a choice between 2 remaining parcels of Whitfield land that had not already been claimed to settle the larger obligation. The first parcel was a modest but respectable stretch of pasture near the village, fertile ground that any sensible farmer's daughter, the Duke's letter made plain, ought to accept without hesitation. The second was a small, stony farm at the parish's furthest edge called Larkfield, which had stood empty and untended for the better part of a decade. Its soil regarded throughout the county as thin and unforgiving, its previous tenants having abandoned it, one after another across the years, for want of any crop that would reliably grow there. The Duke did not trouble himself to disguise which choice he expected, nor which choice he considered the only sensible one. He had added, at his letter's close, a line she would remember for the whole of the difficult year that followed, that Larkfield had ruined every farmer fool enough to attempt it, and that she would do well not to let sentiment or stubbornness lead her into choosing a worthless patch of stone over honest, productive ground. She did not yet understand why the Duke troubled himself to advise her so particularly on a matter he plainly considered beneath his notice. She would understand, in time, and the understanding would prove far more consequential than either of them could have guessed on that cold autumn morning. Helena had been raised, unlike so many gentlewomen of her acquaintance, with dirt genuinely beneath her fingernails, for her father, Miss Josiah Whitfield, had been a farmer first and a gentleman only by the thinnest and most technical of distinctions, and he had taught his only daughter across the whole of her childhood more of soil and season and careful husbandry than any drawing-room accomplishment the county's finer families might have expected of her. It was, perhaps, this unusual education that had left her so poorly prepared for the particular grief and social diminishment that followed his sudden death, for she had lost not merely a father, but the one steady presence who had never once suggested that her practical knowledge was anything less than a genuine and valuable inheritance. Her mother had died years before, in Helena's own girlhood, and the aunts and cousins who might otherwise have offered shelter in her hour of loss proved, almost without exception, more interested in what remained of the Whitfield name's respectability than in Helena herself. She endured, across those 4 difficult months between her father's death and the Duke's fateful letter, a steady stream of well-meaning but thoroughly unhelpful advice, that she ought to seek a position as a companion to some elderly relation, that she ought to consider, however unromantic the prospect, whatever modest marriage might still be arranged for a woman of her diminished circumstances, that she ought, above all, to abandon any notion of managing land herself for farming. Whatever her father's unusual indulgence had taught her was no fit occupation for a gentlewoman alone. She listened to this advice with the particular patient exhaustion of a woman who has heard the same well-meaning cruelty phrased a dozen different ways, and found, beneath her grief, a small and stubborn kernel of resolve that surprised even herself. She did not wish to be a companion, nor a hastily arranged wife, nor a burden passed carefully between relations who resented the passing. She wished, however impractical the wish appeared to everyone around her, to farm. She did not yet understand how thoroughly that quiet wish would be tested by the choice the Duke's letter now placed before her. She chose Larkfield. She made the choice not out of blind sentiment, as the Duke's letter had so condescendingly predicted, but out of a memory she had carried, largely unexamined, since her earliest childhood, a memory of her father speaking, on rare and uncharacteristically wistful occasions, of Larkfield's soil as something other than the worthless, stony ground the rest of the county believed it to be. He had never explained himself fully on those occasions, and Helena had been too young at the time to think to press him for details he seemed, even then, oddly reluctant to share. But the memory had lingered, and in the absence of any better guide through the impossible choice before her, she found herself trusting it. Word of her decision travelled through the parish with the particular speed such stories always seem to acquire, and the Duke himself, upon hearing of it, was heard by more than one servant to laugh, a short, incredulous sound, followed by the remark, repeated afterward across half the county's kitchens and drawing rooms with considerable relish, that the Whitfield girl had chosen to ruin herself entirely, and that he, for one, did not intend to be surprised when Larkfield finished what her father's debts had already begun. She did not yet understand how much that careless mockery would come to cost him. Larkfield, when Helena arrived there in the last cold days of autumn, with what little remained of her father's possessions loaded into a hired cart, presented, at first glance, precisely the discouraging picture the county's gossip had led her to expect. The farmhouse itself stood sound enough, if modest and long neglected, its roof holding against the weather, though its rooms carried the particular musty chill of a house too long left empty. The fields beyond, however, told a harder story, thin, stony soil visible even beneath the season's first light frost, the low stone walls that divided one field from another crumbling in places, the whole property carrying an air of a place the world had simply given up attempting to cultivate. She spent her first weeks there in the same manner she had spent so many difficult weeks since her father's death, in patient, unglamorous labour, clearing the farmhouse of its accumulated dust and neglect, walking the fields themselves with a careful, assessing eye that drew on every scrap of practical knowledge her father had ever shared with her. It was in the 3rd week, clearing the small root cellar beneath the farmhouse kitchen, that she found the first of the hidden journals. They were her father's own hand, though considerably younger and less careful than the writing she remembered from his later years, and the dates upon their opening pages placed them some 25 years before her own birth, a period she realized with a slow, dawning astonishment when her father had himself once farmed this very ground, long before circumstances she had never fully understood had led him to abandon it for the more respectable pasture nearer the village. What remained hidden within those pages was far more dangerous and far more valuable than Helena could have guessed on that first candlelit reading. The journals described not a barren, unforgiving farm, but a soil possessed of a peculiar and remarkable quality, a particular composition, rich in the mineral deposits of an old limestone seam that ran beneath the whole of Larkfield's modest acreage, which her father had discovered, through years of careful and largely secret experimentation, to be extraordinarily well-suited to a singular crop, the cultivation of saffron. She did not yet understand, in that first astonished reading, quite how significant such a discovery might prove. Saffron, she knew only vaguely from her father's occasional mention of it, was among the most valuable crops grown anywhere in England, prized by apothecaries for its medicinal properties and by the finest London confectioners and dye makers for a colour and flavour no other plant could reliably replicate. Its price, ounce for ounce, exceeding that of nearly any other agricultural product in the kingdom. Her father, the journals revealed across their carefully documented pages, had cultivated a modest but genuinely successful saffron harvest at Larkfield for nearly 3 full seasons, his careful experiments finally yielding a crop of remarkable quality and quantity before, abruptly, in the journal's final entries, the whole venture came to an end the pages themselves did not fully explain. There was first the matter of the sealed final entry. The journal's last several pages had been sealed with wax, a practice her father had employed nowhere else within its covers, and Helena spent a full evening working the brittle seal free with the careful patience of a woman who suspected, correctly, that whatever lay beneath it would matter considerably to her own present circumstances. What she found, when the wax finally gave way, was an entry written in a hand considerably less steady than the journal's earlier pages, describing a visit paid to Larkfield by the previous Duke of Ravensmoor, Cassius Thorne's own father, in the final autumn of her father's saffron cultivation. The visit, the entry described, had not been a friendly one. The elder Duke had arrived unannounced, inspected the fields with open and considerable interest, and departed with a proposal Josiah Whitfield had found, even in his own careful and restrained recollection, deeply troubling, that the Duke's own considerably larger estate should take over the saffron cultivation entirely, purchasing Larkfield's growing rights outright for a sum the elder Duke clearly considered generous, and Josiah Whitfield, the entry made plain, ought to consider himself fortunate that a man of such consequence had troubled himself to notice a tenant farmer's modest experiment at all. Her father had refused. The journal's final entry, written with a restraint that could not quite disguise the fear beneath it, recorded only that the refusal had been met with a coldness that left little doubt as to what consequences might follow, and that Josiah Whitfield had resolved, that same autumn, to abandon Larkfield entirely, rather than risk whatever retaliation the Duke's displeasure might bring upon a family with so little standing to withstand it. She did not yet understand why a Duke already possessed of such considerable wealth would trouble himself so particularly over one tenant farmer's modest saffron crop. She would understand only when a second discovery, buried deeper still within the farmhouse's few remaining outbuildings, revealed a truth considerably larger than her father's own quiet abandonment. There was, second, the matter of the locked shed. At the farm's northern boundary stood a small stone outbuilding, its door secured by a heavy padlock whose key had evidently been lost or deliberately removed sometime in the years since her father's departure. Helena, with the assistance of a local blacksmith, willing to work for whatever modest payment she could offer, finally forced the lock open in her 5th week at Larkfield, and found within not merely her father's abandoned farming implements, but a small collection of carefully preserved saffron corms, the very bulbs from which the prized crocus flowers would grow. Packed in dry sand and sealed against decay with a care that suggested her father had never entirely abandoned the hope that someone, someday, might return to Larkfield and take up the cultivation he himself had been too frightened to continue. There was, third, the matter of old Mrs. Perrin, an elderly woman who had once served as her father's housekeeper during his years at Larkfield, and who still lived in a cottage not far from the farm's boundary, proved oddly reluctant when Helena sought her out to ask what she might recall of those distant years. She confirmed, cautiously, that she remembered the saffron fields well, and remembered too the elder Duke's unwelcome visit. But she grew visibly uneasy whenever Helena pressed her for further detail, deflecting her questions with a haste that seemed, to Helena's increasingly practiced eye, considerably more deliberate than simple forgetfulness. It was not until her third visit when Helena happened to mention a curious detail from her father's journal, a reference to the other fields whose fate the sealed entry had never fully explained, that Mrs. Perrin's composure finally cracked, and she admitted, in a lowered voice, that Josiah Whitfield had not been the only tenant farmer in the parish to have once cultivated saffron upon land now held by the Duke of Ravensmore. She would say no more that particular afternoon, but her words opened a mystery considerably larger than Helena had anticipated, one that would not fully resolve itself for several weeks more, and that would, when it finally did, connect every earlier clue into a single, deliberate pattern reaching back considerably further than her own father's quiet abandonment. There was, fourth, and most troubling of all, the matter of the strange visitor who came by night, though its full explanation would not surface until several weeks after Helena first noticed the lantern light moving across her northern boundary, a mystery to which the story will return in its proper place. There was, fifth, the matter of the boundary stone. Walking the perimeter of Larkfield's modest acreage in her 8th week upon the property, Helena discovered, half buried beneath a tangle of frost-blackened bramble, an old stone marker considerably older than any of the estate's more recent boundary walls, its surface worn nearly smooth, but still bearing, upon careful inspection by lamplight, the faint outline of a carved symbol, a single stylized crocus flower, flanked by initials she did not immediately recognize. She copied the marking, as best she could, into her own notebook, and carried the sketch to Mr. Pruitt, the parish clerk of a neighbouring village, whose reputation for local history extended, by fortunate coincidence, well beyond his own parish boundary. Having assisted more than one family across the county in tracing old land disputes through the region's tangled and often poorly kept records, Pruitt recognised the symbol at once, though it took him some considerable searching through the county archive to locate the record he sought, a grant dated nearly a century before Helena's own birth, establishing Larkfield and several neighbouring parcels as lands specifically and formally designated for the cultivation of saffron under an old agricultural charter that predated the current Ravensmore family's own acquisition of the surrounding estate by several generations. The charter, Pruitt explained, had never been formally revoked, merely allowed to lapse from active memory as one tenant farmer after another abandoned the difficult and specialised cultivation it described, a lapse that had proven, Helena now understood with a fresh and considerable clarity, rather more convenient to the current Duke's family than mere historical accident could easily explain. There was, sixth, the peculiar matter of the estate steward's account books. Ashcombe, in the weeks following his own reluctant confession, proved willing to share rather more than his initial nighttime admission had suggested, and it was through his own quiet access to the estate's considerable financial records that Helena first glimpsed the true scale of the arrangement her father's sealed journal entry had only partially explained. The Ravensmore estate's ledgers, Ashcombe revealed with visible discomfort, showed a curious and consistent pattern across nearly 2 decades. Modest, but regular payments to the same London merchant, recorded under vague and deliberately unremarkable headings that corresponded precisely to the quiet suppression of no fewer than 4 separate tenant farming ventures across the parish, each one. Upon Helena's own careful cross-referencing against Mrs. Perrin's growing store of local memory, ended within a single season of showing genuine promise. She did not yet understand the full human cost of this pattern, stretching back across 2 decades of quiet, deliberate suppression, though she suspected, with a growing anger that steadied rather than overwhelmed her, that her own father's abandoned dream had been merely one among several similar tragedies the county's admiring view of Ravensmoor's grand harvests had never once thought to question. There was, 7th, the matter of the widow at Elmside. Mrs. Perrin's cautious reference to other fields led Helena, in her 10th week at Larkfield, to seek out a Mrs. Agatha Bell, a widow living in considerably reduced circumstances at the parish's eastern edge, whose late husband, Helena learned through careful and patient inquiry, had attempted his own modest saffron cultivation upon a small parcel of land some 15 years before her father's own venture had even begun. Mrs. Bell, when Helena finally worked up the courage to call upon her, proved rather less reluctant than Mrs. Perrin had been to speak of the matter, her own long years of diminished circumstance having worn away whatever discretion she might once have felt obligated to maintain toward a family who had, by her own bitter reckoning, contributed directly to her husband's early death from the strain of debts he could never afterward repay. Mrs. Bell's own account, corroborated in painful detail by papers she had kept for 15 years against exactly this eventuality, confirmed what Ashcombe's ledgers had only suggested in outline, that the elder Duke's scheme had begun considerably earlier than her own father's experience, and had claimed, across its long and quiet operation, rather more than the modest number of victims Helena had initially supposed. She left Mrs. Bell's cottage that afternoon with a fuller and considerably heavier understanding of precisely what her own success at Larkfield might mean, not merely for her own fortunes, but for a parish's worth of quietly buried grievances that had never before found anyone willing or able to bring them properly into the light. It was in her 7th week at Larkfield that Helena first noticed a lantern light moving across the boundary between her own fields and the Duke's considerably larger estate beyond, a light that appeared only after midnight and that vanished on the 2 occasions she ventured out to investigate it directly, before she could approach closely enough to identify whoever carried it. She did not yet understand who watched her fields with such quiet, persistent interest so soon after her arrival, though she suspected, with a growing unease she could not entirely dismiss, that whoever it was had taken rather more notice of her father's old saffron corms than idle curiosity alone could explain. Winter deepened around Larkfield through those weeks of careful, uneasy discovery, and Helena, working now not merely from curiosity, but from a growing and increasingly determined purpose, began the slow, painstaking work of preparing the old saffron fields for planting, clearing stone, restoring the careful drainage her father's journals described in such loving detail, and waiting, through the coldest months of that difficult year, for the particular narrow planting window the crocus corms would require. Before this story carries you further into the truth behind the Duke's long-buried interest in saffron, and into the confrontation that would finally test both Helena's resolve and the House of Thorns' own carefully guarded secrets, allow one more small request. If Helena's patient restoration of her father's abandoned fields has earned even a small place in your evening, then let that subscribe button be the thing you press before the next chapter begins. And do tell us, below, who you suspect has been watching Larkfield's fields by lantern light. Some of you, I imagine, already have your guesses. The truth behind the elder Duke's long-forgotten interest in saffron began to emerge in earnest when Mrs. Perrin, some weeks after her first cautious admission, arrived at Larkfield's door unannounced, carrying with her a small bundle of letters she had kept, she confessed, for nearly 20 years, uncertain whether she would ever find cause or courage to share them. The letters, written in a hand Helena did not immediately recognise, proved to be correspondence between the elder Duke of Ravensmore and a merchant contact in London, dated to the very autumn described in her father's sealed journal entry, and they revealed a scheme considerably more calculated than simple acquisitive greed. The elder Duke, the letters made plain, had learned of Josiah Whitfield's successful saffron cultivation not through casual observation, but through deliberate inquiry, having grown concerned that a small tenant farmer's modest success might, if permitted to continue and expand, threaten a considerably larger and more lucrative arrangement the Duke's own estate had quietly established with the same London merchant, an arrangement in which the Duke's estate purchased inferior, imported saffron at a discounted rate and resold it, through the merchant's own considerable London connections, at prices inflated by the same scarcity that made genuine English-grown saffron so valuable. A thriving local cultivation, openly competing on quality and freshness that imported goods could never match, threatened to expose the whole arrangement as the quiet, profitable deception it had always been. The elder Duke had not merely wished to purchase Larkfield's growing rights for his own estate's benefit, as her father's journal had recorded. He had wished, more precisely, to ensure that no independent saffron cultivation of genuine quality survived anywhere in the parish to threaten a considerably more profitable and considerably less honest arrangement he had built with his London merchant contact. What remained hidden, connecting every earlier clue Helena had gathered across those long winter weeks, was now laid bare with an emotional weight that struck her far harder than she had anticipated. Mrs. Perrin's own uneasy reluctance, explained at last by a woman who had watched her employer's quiet ruin unfold and had carried the guilt of her own silence for 2 full decades. The reference to other fields, explained by letters that named, in careful and damning detail, no fewer than 3 other tenant farmers across the parish whose own promising saffron experiments had met similarly abrupt and similarly coerced ends within that same fateful autumn. Even the mysterious lantern light at Larkfield's northern boundary, which Helena now suspected, with a fresh and considerable unease, might belong not to some idle trespasser, but to someone considerably more invested in ensuring her own cultivation met the same quiet fate as her father's before it. Mrs. Bell's fuller account also carried, though Helena did not learn its full significance until weeks later, a curious detail she had nearly overlooked in the raw emotion of that first difficult conversation. A mention that her own husband, in the final desperate months before his death, had written directly to the current Duke, then a young man newly come into some portion of his father's authority, pleading for the debt's forbearance and receiving, in reply, a single cold line that Mrs. Bell had kept among her husband's papers for 15 years, precisely because its careless cruelty had never stopped paining her, that the estate could not be expected to indulge every tenant's unrealistic ambitions, and that Mr. Bell would be wise to accept his losses and move on, as more sensible men before him had already done. Helena carried this fragment away with her, turning it over in her mind through the long walk back to Larkfield in the fading afternoon light, and found herself wondering, with an unease she could not entirely dismiss, whether the current Duke's own hand in these old cruelties ran deeper than his later confession to her would ultimately admit, a question she resolved to hold carefully in reserve. Evidence enough to press, should his cooperation, once secured, ever prove less than complete. The winter weeks that followed these discoveries passed in a strange and uneasy rhythm, Helena's days divided between the careful, hopeful labour of preparing her father's saffron fields for spring planting and the steadily mounting weight of a truth that reached, she now understood, considerably further than her own family's quiet ruin. She wrote, in the evenings, careful letters to each of the wronged families. Ashcomb's ledgers and Mrs. Bell's testimony had helped her identify, not yet revealing the full scope of what she had learned, but gently inquiring after their own memories of the matter, building, letter by careful letter, a body of corroborating testimony that no single dismissal from the House of Thorn could easily overcome. Not every reply encouraged her. Two of the families, fearful still of the Ravensmoor estate's considerable influence over their own remaining tenancies, wrote back with careful, guarded evasion, unwilling to risk what little security they still possessed by aligning themselves too openly with a young woman whose own defiance of the Duke remained, at that point, entirely unproven. Helena did not press them further, understanding all too well, from her own months of precarious circumstance, precisely what fear could cost a family with so little cushion against a powerful man's displeasure. But two others, Mrs. Bell chief among them, replied with a growing and increasingly open willingness to see the matter finally addressed, and it was this small, hard-won coalition of testimony that Helena carried with her alongside her father's own journals when she finally rode to Ravensmoor House in the first week of March. Before that final confrontation, however, one further piece of the mystery remained to be resolved: the identity of the figure behind the lantern light at Larkfield's northern boundary, a question that had lingered unanswered through those long winter weeks, even as Helena's other discoveries multiplied around it. She confronted this suspicion directly on a bitter night in late February, when the lantern light appeared once more across the boundary hedge, and this time, rather than watching from a distance as she had on previous occasions, she walked directly toward it. Lantern of her own held high against the darkness, and found herself face to face with a young man she recognized, from occasional sightings at the parish church, as Mr. Reginald Ashcombe, a distant cousin of the Duke's own line, who managed, on the current Duke's behalf, a considerable portion of the Ravensmoor estate's own extensive grain fields. Ashcombe did not attempt, once discovered, to disguise the true purpose of his nighttime visits. He confessed, with a bitterness that surprised Helena considerably more than any evasion might have done, that he had been sent by the Duke himself to monitor Larkfield's progress, under instructions to report immediately should her cultivation show any genuine sign of success. Instructions Ashcombe had followed with growing reluctance, for he had, in the course of his careful watching, come to admire the very persistence he had been ordered to help undermine. He would say no more that particular night, retreating once more toward the Ravensmoor estate before Helena could press him further, but he left behind a single, troubling admission that the current Duke, whatever his father's original scheme, had inherited both the arrangement with the London merchant and a considerable personal stake in ensuring it remained undisturbed, for the estate's own finances, strained by years of his father's mismanagement and his own recent extravagances, depended more heavily upon that quietly inflated saffron trade than the county's admiring view of Ravensmoor's grand harvests would ever suggest. She did not yet understand, standing in the cold February darkness with this fresh and unsettling knowledge, quite how directly the current Duke's own fortunes had come to depend upon her own quiet failure. She understood only that the confrontation she had been building toward, however cautiously, could no longer be delayed. She went to Ravensmoor House in the first week of March, her father's journals and Mrs. Perrin's carefully preserved letters gathered together as proof considerably more thorough than any single piece of evidence alone could have provided. And she was received. In the grand and imposing study, where so much of the county's business was quietly settled, by a Duke whose composure, she noted with some private satisfaction, seemed rather more strained than the cold, dismissive letter he had once sent her. She laid the evidence before him without preamble: her father's sealed journal entry, the merchant correspondence Mrs. Perrin had kept for 20 guarded years, and the plain, unavoidable arithmetic of an estate whose grand harvests, she now understood, depended considerably more upon a quietly inflated saffron trade than upon any genuine agricultural excellence the county so admiringly attributed to the House of Thorn. The Duke's face, through the whole of her careful, measured recitation, betrayed considerably less than she had steeled herself to expect. She was beginning to understand, a man who had built his own composure upon rarely allowing the world to witness the moment it finally struck him. But his silence, when at last she finished, stretched long enough that she began to wonder whether he intended to answer her at all. When he spoke, finally, it was not the denial she had half expected, nor the practiced dismissal of a man certain of his own family's rightness. He told her, in a voice stripped for the first time of its habitual coldness, that he had inherited the arrangement with the London merchant as a simple, unquestioned fact of the estate's finances, never once troubling himself to examine its true foundations, and that he had, in his own recent mockery of her choice to farm Larkfield, been repeating a family habit of careless dismissal, without once wondering what that dismissal had truly been protecting. He did not ask her forgiveness outright, for pride, even now, would not quite permit so complete a surrender. But he offered something Helena had not anticipated, and had certainly not come seeking: an end to Ashcombe's surveillance, a formal acknowledgement of Larkfield's legitimate cultivation, and, more surprising still, an offer to sever the estate's own quietly dishonest merchant arrangement entirely, however uncertain the estate's finances might grow without it. She did not accept this offer immediately, nor entirely on faith, for trust so thoroughly betrayed by one generation could not be rebuilt in a single afternoon's confession, however sincere it appeared. But she did not refuse it outright either, and in the weeks that followed, a cautious alliance began to take shape between the Duke of Ravensmoor and the young woman he had once so publicly mocked. The truth, once surfaced, could not be buried again so easily as it had been the first time. Spring arrived at Larkfield with a gentleness the previous autumn's grief had not prepared Helena to expect. The crocus corms she had so carefully preserved and planted through the bitter winter months finally beginning to show their first tentative shoots above the thin, stony soil her father's journals had so lovingly described. She tended them with a vigilance that left little room for anything beyond the fields themselves, rising before dawn each morning to check for frost damage, working late into the evening by lamplight to record each stage of the crocus's careful development exactly as her father's own journals had once taught her. Ashcombe, whose earlier reluctant surveillance had given way entirely to genuine and increasingly open assistance once the full truth of the Duke's arrangement had come to light, proved an unexpectedly valuable ally through those anxious spring weeks, his own considerable knowledge of the estate's grain cultivation offering practical wisdom that complemented her father's more specialized saffron. Expertise in ways neither of them had anticipated. The harvest itself, when the crocus flowers finally bloomed in the particular narrow window such delicate cultivation required, exceeded even the modest hopes Helena had allowed herself across that long, uncertain winter. She harvested the field's precious crimson stigmas by hand, exactly as her father's journals described, working alongside Mrs. Perrin and two of the old housekeeper's granddaughters, through several long, careful days of painstaking labour, until the whole of Larkfield's modest acreage had yielded a quantity of saffron that, by any reasonable estimate, exceeded her father's own best-remembered harvest by a considerable margin. Mrs. Bell came to help as well, in those final harvest days, insisting, despite Helena's gentle protest, that she wished to see with her own eyes the crop her husband had never lived to grow himself, and the two women worked side by side through a long, golden afternoon that Helena would remember, in later years, as one of the quiet turning points of that whole difficult season. Not the moment of vindication itself, which was still some weeks distant, but the moment she understood that her own small victory had already begun to mend, in whatever modest way it could, wounds considerably older and deeper than her own. She did not yet understand, gathering those final delicate threads of crimson into their careful storage, quite how thoroughly her fortunes had turned. She would understand it fully only weeks later, when she carried her first modest sample to the same London merchant whose quiet arrangement with the Ravensmoor estate had so nearly ended her father's cultivation 20 years before. A merchant who, confronted with saffron of genuine, uncompromised quality, rather than the inferior imported goods he had grown accustomed to reselling at inflated prices, offered her a sum for her first crop that left her, by her own careful reckoning, considerably wealthier than the whole of the Ravensmoor estate's grand autumn harvest of grain and wool combined. Word of the sale travelled through the county with the particular swiftness such stories always seem to acquire, and the Duke himself, upon hearing the sum involved, was heard by more than one servant to fall entirely silent. A silence considerably more telling, to those who had once delighted in his earlier incredulous laughter, than any words he might have offered in its place. The Duke of Ravensmoor visited Larkfield often in the seasons that followed, and if the county noticed how much more frequently his visits fell than any remaining business between their two households strictly required, and how much less coldly he now spoke, in company, of the young woman whose patient cultivation of a supposedly worthless farm had exposed his own family's long-buried dishonesty, and, in doing so, finally set it right. They were, for the most part, too well accustomed by now to Larkfield's remarkable turn of fortune to remark upon it with any particular surprise. He kept, too, the promise he had made in that first cautious meeting at Ravensmoor House, formally severing the estate's arrangement with the London merchant despite the considerable financial adjustment such honesty required, and offering, to each of the families Helena's careful letters had identified, a measure of restitution that could not undo the years already lost. But that went some considerable way toward acknowledging what those years had truly cost them. Mrs. Bell, in particular, received a settlement generous enough to see her final years free of the diminished circumstance she had endured for so long, and she wrote to Helena, upon receiving it, a brief letter of thanks that Helena kept, ever after, alongside her father's own journals. As proof that patient truth-telling could accomplish what anger alone had never managed across 15 long years of quiet grief. What passed between Helena and the Duke in the months that followed was not the swift, easy sentiment of a storybook reconciliation, for both had been shaped too thoroughly by loss and by one family's long history of quiet cruelty to embrace such simple resolution. It was instead a slower, more careful thing, built first upon the shared labour of restoring not merely a farm, but an honest reputation, upon long afternoons spent together, walking the boundary between their two properties, discussing the estate's own gradual transition toward more honest and more genuinely productive practices, and only, gradually, as trust accumulated in small and hard-won increments, into something warmer and considerably more honest than either had believed themselves capable of feeling toward the other. Mrs. Perrin, in the seasons that followed, took to visiting Larkfield's fields each spring with a lightness her long decades of quiet guilt had never before permitted her, and spoke often to anyone curious enough to ask of the particular satisfaction of watching an old friend's son's abandoned dream finally receive, through his daughter's patient courage, the vindication it had always deserved. She remained, until her own final years, a fixture at Larkfield's spring harvests, teaching the careful hand picking of the crocus stigmas to whichever young women of the parish came to help, so that the particular knowledge her old employer had once guarded so fearfully might never again be lost to a single family's quiet ruin. Helena Whitfield never again heard her family's name spoken with the pitying, dismissive tones the county had once reserved for a ruined gentleman farmer's orphaned daughter. She heard it instead spoken, across the county and increasingly beyond it, with the particular respect reserved for those whose quiet, unglamorous devotion is eventually proven right. A respect earned not through inheritance alone, nor through any single season's triumphant sale, but through patient labour upon stony ground that everyone else had long since agreed to call worthless, and through a refusal to accept that a man's careless mockery must remain, forever, the final word on what her father's forgotten fields were truly worth. And on quiet spring evenings, long after that first triumphant harvest had become simply and comfortably a settled part of Larkfield's ordinary life, visitors walking among the crocus fields at dusk would sometimes pause to watch the last light catch upon rows of pale purple blooms, their crimson threads glowing faintly in the fading sun, and they would understand, whether or not anyone troubled to explain it to them fully, that they stood within a story preserved in the quiet, patient memory of one small English farm, saved not by grand rescue, but by one woman's refusal to let a stony, forgotten field remain, forever, exactly as worthless as a careless duke had once so confidently declared it. She kept, in a small drawer of her father's old writing desk, the very letter that had begun it all, the duke's first cold instruction, folded now soft with handling, its condescending certainty long since drained of any power to wound her. She kept it not from bitterness, nor even entirely from pride, though pride had certainly played its part in the long months of labour that followed its arrival. She kept it, rather, as her father had once kept his own careful, hopeful journals through so many years of quiet fear, as a record that some truths, however thoroughly buried or however confidently dismissed, will wait patiently as any corn beneath winter soil for someone willing to give them the chance to finally bloom. She thought of it often in the years that followed, tending Larkfield's steadily expanding fields through seasons that grew, one by one, considerably easier to bear than the desperate autumn in which her story had begun. She thought of the Tuesday morning the letter had first arrived, of the particular sting of a stranger's careless certainty, and of how thoroughly the world could still be made to answer it, not through anger, which she had learned wasted itself quickly against men so thoroughly convinced of their own rightness, but through the slower, steadier proof of work well done, and a truth, patiently and faithfully uncovered, finally permitted to bloom exactly as her father had always quietly believed it could. Larkfield's fields, in the years that followed, grew steadily beyond their original modest acreage as neighbouring tenant farmers, encouraged by Helena's own success and by the Duke's own newly honest management of the wider estate, began cautiously returning to crops and methods they had long since abandoned as too risky for a family without the standing to weather a landlord's displeasure. Ashcombe, whose own careful stewardship had earned him a trust the Duke extended to few others, oversaw much of this quiet agricultural revival personally, and spoke often, in later years, of Larkfield as the place where he had first learned that loyalty to a name was worth considerably less than loyalty to the truth. And so the parish that had once regarded Larkfield as a byword for ruin came, within a handful of seasons, to regard it instead as proof of something considerably harder to dismiss, that the worth of a piece of ground, like the worth of the person who tends it, is rarely settled by another's careless word alone, but by the patient, unglamorous labour that words so often fails to anticipate.